what is the subject or the theme of this afternoon's session, the interpreter and his world, and her world. And I'd like to link this, if you will, with the morning session of our colloquium. We'll be analyzing the social dimension, the insertion of conference interpreting in the world. This morning we were asking ourselves if we were going to give technology a privileged position as a factor in change. And we can analyze this also in terms of whether or not we privilege technology as a factor of change in human relationships. We face today not only technological progress, but also a myth that is auto-generated or self-generated outside of our own society and sometimes alien to our own true needs. The myth is that we are supposed to be building a better world that will make us happier and free us up to have more time for our leisure activities. But this is a myth that has taken on, in some cases, apocalyptic proportions, if you will. And I think it doesn't really match reality. I'd like, and I'll be daring in doing so. This isn't the first greatest social transformation in the history of humanity. And since we're amongst interpreters in this meeting, I'll ask you to allow me to dare to speak of the future, but really referring to the past. Because if we are not able to learn from the past, as you well know, it said we'll be condemned to repeat the errors of the past. This young profession, founded at the middle of the last century, and that is only today 75 years old or so, has already been through one such process and mutation or traumatic change. I'm referring here to a profession that, even though it was born only 65 years ago, is in fact a very old or ancient profession. Our profession exists for as long as we have written and recorded history. We know that there were interpreters at work long before Columbus. There were interpreters in the Bible accounts. They weren't called interpreters, they were called spies. But we know that they existed. Spies, the spies that were sent from Israel by Moses into Canaan. And throughout history, we know that interpretation, or the profession of interpreting, has been shaped by interpersonal and personal characteristics, with basically a small number of participants, and with something that was inseparable from the physical presence of the interpreter, at least in historical terms, because those who needed and benefited from the service or the work of interpreters shared the same space with interpreters. The 20th century was a century of major conflicts, of great wars, in which there was also a need to resolve conflicts and achieve peace. And this required many interpreters to attend to those efforts, such as the League of Nations, the Nuremberg trials, which have already been mentioned in our meeting, and the United Nations. And it's through these experiences that our profession is born, and we, in a way, inherit our association as a result of these new needs. And our profession is born then also as a result of the concentration of political power in the so-called First World. It's the needs for interpretation that drive this effort and brings simultaneous interpretation to an audience which did not exist before this time. Also, a need to find solutions. Before the Nuremberg trials, the famous hushaphone, which was similar to a telephone system developed in 1926, when IBM develops its first efforts and tests at allowing communication to a much broader public that would address a problem that society recognized it needed to address, such as finding a way to end war. And we moved then from consecutive interpretation to simultaneous interpretation, and this is not merely an anecdotal fact. This was a traumatic shift. We don't necessarily talk about it in these terms today, but that doesn't mean that it was not traumatic. This looks a lot like the world that we've been talking about today. The arrival of simultaneous interpretation affected a tiny group of people, almost, if you will, a clique of people, and these were professionals or persons who were very technically gifted. I'm sure they would have been considered extremely gifted individuals, mostly men, and also people who played a clearly important and visible role as protagonists in a public space, in a space of power and prestige and public recognition. That group, as might be the case for many of us, faced with the challenges of new technologies and techniques, resisted these new techniques. Simultaneous interpreting meant that this group disparaged the literality of that work, and you could see the shadow of the source language, the lack of analysis and discourse, the lack of analysis and accentuation or emphasis, and a lack also of more rhetorical language to something much more monotonous. And if we see, these aren't challenges that are all that different. The interpreter in a simultaneous interpreting context is going to be invisible. He's going to lose that protagonism, lose prestige, lose power, and probably income as well. So we find ourselves in a situation where simultaneous interpreting takes conference interpreting outside of the public space, of the public sphere, and confines it to a private space, the interpretation booth, at a time in which, much more than now, public space was the space of politics, where power was displayed, and mainly displayed by men. Social space are spaces that are shared between men and women, but private space, if you will, the home, was practically a space that was reserved to women. And when this shift happened from consecutive to simultaneous interpreting, we move from a public space to a more private space, to booths, to invisibility, a loss of power, and a loss of prestige and protagonism. And you won't be surprised then to hear that we move from a profession that was almost exclusively masculine or male to one that is almost feminized and is made up mostly, largely, of women. This was, if you will, a Copernican change in terms of its importance. This transformation was something that we already went through. This wasn't a change of bricks, but of stones, if you will, but we've already experienced this change. I also want to say that even so, consecutive has not disappeared. It has found and had to find a space of its own. Face-to-face negotiations are still the privileged place for consecutive interpretation, and when personal contact matters, where the gestures and the gestures of the interpreter and the look or the eyes of the interpreter are involved, consecutive is the preferred mode. Simultaneous interpretation allowed for an exponential growth of the market and as a result of the number of working interpreters, of professionals. We'll face challenges, but we'll be able to find solutions, and that was the case in the 1950s, and we came through that for the better. So we have now moved outside of the privileged or reserved space of interpretation booths, and now we are looking at situations where we want to be able to be visible directly. The interpreter in the booth is subject to the rhythm that is imposed on him or her by the speaker. So there's a loss of personal contact, of prestige. There's an automation, if you will, of the rhetorical style of simultaneous, and the interpreter is excluded, if you will, from the dynamic of communication and just becomes the off voice, like we hear on a radio. The power of radio and the influence of news on the radio made many researchers look into this and think about a radio voice as the voice of God, something that was intangible. And our voices as interpreters are also voices that are like this, like radio voices, invisible. But interpreters somehow then become part of the machine. We've almost all heard people say, "Can I get a translator?" meaning a receiver. So we're sometimes confused with the machine. We're part of that machine. So we're not actually facing something entirely new now. Even though it is somewhat daunting and different for us to face a flat screen, we're not necessarily synchronized with the lips of our speakers. The understanding of a speech where what we see with the eye doesn't match what with what we're hearing in a synchronized way, and there's a loss of meaning as a result. That's why it was so important that video conferences match up the synchronicities of the audio and the visual so that this disconcerting effect is avoided. And you don't hear something that doesn't match what you're seeing, where you don't hear an open vowel when the lips are closed. That confuses our brain. There's also a spatial disconnection, a temporal disconnection because of time zones. Imagine if we're working with a platform that's based in Asia and we'll be working halfway around the world in contact with a whole different world. So these are the real problems that we need to learn to face. As my colleague Klaus was saying, in effect, we have to learn to live with the challenges that we have and to do so with good quality results, learn the mechanisms that will allow us to incorporate new technologies in a successful way. Not uncritically and not accepting them just as they come, because society also won't accept them uncritically. As Rob was saying, this isn't necessarily going to be a world of congresses with disconnected mobile platforms, but there's a high price that probably society is not necessarily willing to pay. No company is necessarily going to invest in having virtual meetings that do not benefit them in the way that they need fundamentally to benefit from conferences or meetings. I'm not referring here to interpretation only, but in the world of interpreting, we've moved from the public sphere to now the private space, where we are full on in a transition to virtual spaces. But I don't think that there's any room here for pessimism. I don't think it's useful, and I don't think we can give ourselves to a sort of professional Darwinistic view. I like to look to examples so that we're not only circumscribed by the small world of our own profession. The advent of cinema, we should remember, did not mean the end of theater. What it meant was that the demand for theater became a more specialized and a more intimate experience that they did not get from the cinema screen. The imperfection, the humanity of the imperfection of actors on stage, or who mistakes a cue and enters at the wrong time. But there's a specialization where an audience wants a direct communication, and they want to be present when that theatrical act is created. That's an important and emotionally charged moment that cinema or movies are never going to be able to match. Likewise, radio did not mean the end of the written press. TV didn't mean the end of radio or cinema, or cinemas, and video on demand did not mean the end of TV. The internet didn't finish off radio or cinema or the written press. So I think we have to face this with, I think, a bit more optimism. This business of migratory movements that we've been talking about didn't just happen recently. This happened over 100 years ago, or a century and a half ago, when, even though a lot of people are not aware of it, these migratory movements are now visible because of the availability of media reports and widely disseminated information. But all of those minorities, those national and ethnic minorities, those refugee camps that we've heard about, cannot be left alone. And I think the public is more informed. There's more of a political demand from our governments that we can't accept necessarily relegating minorities to their own situations. So there's a possibility that we try to do things today that could have been thought impossible before. We can say that with this new public consciousness, there are new social needs and an awareness of social needs, specialized demands for what's going to happen in our global space. I don't think we have to be apocalyptic about the emergence of new technologies. There are things that we have to be very aware of and clear about. But we don't need to be fearful of this. Firstly, because there are solutions, and I think we can begin to see them. And we can see how, over the course of time, we can refine them. We don't have to accept everything that comes to us technologically. I think we ourselves can be agents of this change and not just leave it to a self-fulfilled prophecy in terms of what technology will do for us. And I think this is the case for our world as interpreters. We need to be aware of evolutions, of an evolution that's happening socially, in our economy, the way in which our societies organize themselves politically. And it isn't that this is something that's going to happen. This has already happened. This is a future, if you will, that is already our present. I'll try to be respectful of our time limits and move forward. But I think this is not really a space that is more reduced, but rather one that grows. We're in a world that communicates not less, but more. And I think we need to ask ourselves this question and ask it out loud. Where are we faced with these changes? What efforts have we done as professionals to be visible, to be present where these needs are presenting themselves? Universities have shown themselves to be flexible and capable of change. Many of the things that you've heard from Barbara Moser, universities have understood the need to define how to meet these new needs. Also, Christian talked about this. We need to be able to meet these new competencies and identify amongst these skills what are the sets of behavioral practices that no longer really match with the strictest definition of conference interpreting. They sometimes have to do with intercultural mediation. And these are aspects that are part of our lives socially, but that have been not always considered part of the canon of our work. Universities have been hard at work in creating new degrees, new competencies. They prepare interpreters to work in courts, in public agencies, in areas of conflict zones, or on humanitarian action teams. And I think we need to be able to critically reflect on the theme of this colloquium, the future of our profession. And why not the future of our association as we have known it? Of course, we can work to maintain, and there'll always be a niche for conference interpretation, and there will be one in new technologies as well, and there'll be a niche for conference interpretation in all of these other universes that are available to us now. But we need to ask ourselves if our association is capable of discussing and debating and undertaking the challenge to define new modalities of interpretation, new working conditions, in recognizing it isn't just a matter of conference interpreters as we have always known them, that they go about and do their work without worrying about remuneration, or we clearly must recognize that there's a quantitative leap that is required here. But we need to engage critically in understanding the ethical dimensions of our own profession as it has existed, and also the new forms of interpretation. There are many aspects of this that our own ethical rules have not addressed. We need to address how interpretation is going to be affected, working in areas of intercultural mediation, conflict zones. Not only things that we've heard today from Barbara Moser about how interpreters should behave if they should be identified with one or another of the parties, but how they present themselves and how they handle themselves and how they are perceived. These are things we can't necessarily teach, how interpreters are going to be perceived, the symbology, if they are armed, if they wear uniforms. There are all kinds of aspects that need to be considered and defined. We also must be aware that interpretation is a service that could be universally available or maybe restricted to small interest groups. We can continue being what we always have been for years to come. But I think we should ask ourselves, who are we? The First World members represent 80% of the members of AIIC. And this is the work in which we mostly do our work. And much of the work outside of that group is outside of what we work in as interpreters. And as we see, the growth areas are not going to be in the first world where we are mostly represented, but will happen in Poland, in Asia, in Thailand, in India. It's not going to happen in London or Madrid. And we see these growth patterns already taking off without us. Another question that we must ask ourselves is why is it so hard to attract young people, young professionals? It's alarming, if you will, that we are quickly becoming a very elitist and minority group, more concerned with maintaining our boundaries, differentiating ourselves, keeping our working conditions, protecting our working conditions. Of course, young people would like to have adequate wages and work in good conditions, but there isn't necessarily bread to go around for everyone, and it's difficult to join and belong to our association. This might look like we only work to protect our privileges, but I think the main reason we have a hard time attracting young professionals is because we're not present in the areas in which we heard about from Christian. We are not out in our spheres of social interpreting, community interpreting. We're not in the police stations. We're not in the immigration social service lines. It's true that we must protect ourselves emotionally, physically, materially. We have to understand what the sources of survival will be for us economically, and we must work to protect the dignity of our profession as well, of making the service that we offer a society known, and not only defending our working conditions or our income. This has to do with an ethical understanding. And this is ethics challenged also by the omnipresent role of technology, among other factors. What profession are we going to leave our children and our grandchildren? There's something that doesn't have bad press, even though many things do have bad press, but the intergenerational injustice is something we need to think about. What world are we leaving to generations to come, and what profession are we leaving to those that come after us? We've been able to protect our specialized knowledge, and we've modified and redefined content, and creating a legacy of a profession that I hope we will be able to bequeath to our children and grandchildren, a well-remunerated, well-recognized profession of public service with a humanitarian function and a recognition of an appreciated and dignified service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Well, we've got 45 minutes for questions and debate, and then we also need some time for conclusions, if that's okay. I don't know if people would like to take the floor. We've got a couple of microphones which are around, so maybe somebody could help out with that. If a couple of people could help us with that.
I don't want to talk. I just want.
Les recuerdo a los amigos.
So I just ask our friends who are following us on streaming that they can also ask questions via the chat. Claudia Ricci will take note of those questions to put them at the end. And those present, I'd like to say through the chat we had a reminder that it would be good to introduce yourselves, to say at least your name, where you're from, what you do, so we all know who is speaking. I'm sorry, please.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Claro.
Sorry, because you said to ask questions via the chat. In order to be able to ask questions via the chat, you have to set up your own YouTube channel. Now, understanding that not everybody is going to be willing to do that, you can just email PRIMS or PRIMS Communications. You can find addresses on the PRIMS landing page, and I will relay your questions for you. Sorry.
Ahora sí. Hola.
Hello. So, good afternoon. Javier de Guerra. I'm from Bogota. I'm an interpreter. I'm not from AIIC, but I've been interpreting for over 8 years, maybe up to 10 years. And above all, I'd like to join AIIC. Well, I'd like to thank AIIC and PRIMS for this type of event. You don't get many of such events, but it's a very good event, and I see colleagues with whom I've been working before, and I can see that we're all in the same page, on this. And when I was thinking about the second part of the conference in the afternoon, where you have the name of it's about the future of the profession, and there's a social aspect which has been mentioned as well. And as interpreters, as equipment providers, we're also interested in these aspects. And it could be a threat. What could be a threat at a certain time, and what we see more and more is that you can see, well, like a typical interpreter, I'm saying loads and loads and loads before coming to the point. Could you just take some distance from the microphone, because otherwise it's difficult to hear you. Okay, that's another thing that interpreters do. Sorry for that. Okay, so in the academic sector, or the academic conferences, if I can put it like that, or other types of conferences, or with multilateral parties, I don't know if you've noticed, but what do you see? They have events with, say, 50 people. They're asking for 400 different interpreting apparatus, and what you get is you get 50. And why? One reason why is because you get more and more people who speak English, who are able to speak it, but there are a lot of people who believe that they speak English. You know, a lot of people want to save pace. They don't want to show that they're not bilingual. And so I think that sometimes we have to work on that. And we saw at the beginning, people have to recognize that it's good. Let's face it, one thing, as was said, is to be able to speak your own language in certain forum. But for example, in an academic setting, being able to speak at that level, it takes a long time. Yes, maybe you speak English, but interpreting offers you something else. It really puts the message across. And now you see conferences with, for example, the Physics Nobel Prize, and you have a massive effort to get people to understand that. But if you don't have interpretation, you'll lose 60% of the message, because people don't want to ask for the interpretation equipment in order to listen to it. Now, this is taking me to the point. Sergio, please, could we get straight to the point here? Please be as short as possible. Okay, my point is, what ideas do we have in order to work together as interpreters as well as providers of interpreting equipment when it comes to dealing with this? Because there is a threat that we see to our profession. People are asking, for example, for interpreting equipment, for example, 50 headphones, but then in the end only 10 are given out because people don't want to pick them up. So was your question put to anybody in particular, or is it just a comment? A reflection. that you wanted to make? No, if you, Rob, or anybody else who's more specialized in the market area or within the association has any kind of idea, what can they say about that as regards the future?
Okay, it is a fundamental question, really, and it comes back to this issue I've been thinking about all day, about my side of the conference industry, understanding more about your side, really understanding all the issues that have been discussed today. You're like us. We're both providing a service. The interpretation industry and the conference industry are facilitating communication. We do it through providing conference destinations, conference venues, conference programs, speakers, and then you provide a very clear service, which is the interpreting. Far too often from our side, we regard the interpreting as a kind of, last-minute element of the conference. Oh, and by the way, we should get some interpreters. Today, especially after all the discussions, I can see that we're very, very wrong to think like that we need to really, in our training of conference managers and PCOs, we need to start again with interpreting. It's not something that we mention for an hour on a Friday afternoon. It really should be an integral part of our course, because if we're not providing the right kind of interpreting services, then we cannot honestly say that our conferences are successful. So you have been extremely kind today, inviting me as a representative of the conference industry into your world, and I won't rest until I can get someone from AIIC to come into our world and to come and give these messages to one of our conferences. And believe me, there are many, many international conferences about conferences. It won't be difficult to find a conference. Please come and speak to us and pass on this kind of important message that you just said.
Cristina.
Bueno, para empezar.
Just to start with, Christina de Castilla, conference interpreter from the Mexican, Central American and Caribbean region. So just a couple of questions there for Eduardo. Now, I really appreciated your speech. It was very impressive. The first question that I wanted to put, it's very simple. Now, you said 80% of members of AIIC have, or in first, well, I didn't understand what you said. 80% of members of AIIC come from the first world. Was that it? Well, this is a very good point, which takes us to, through the love of God, to leave or stop, with a lot of respect, dear colleagues, to those colleagues in Geneva and Paris. We are international. There is a part which we have to look at. We have to try and ensure that we really are international. And that's why I'm so pleased that we're in Cartagena, for that and many other reasons, of course. Now, furthermore, when we come to the other point that you mentioned, I didn't understand it very well, I have to say, because why is it so difficult to attract young people, to attract them to AIIC, not to the profession? I think that there are tons of young people in the profession, more and more, in fact, at least in my country, in the world that I know, many more than when I was young. There are lots of young people who are massively interested in it, in this vocation. So why is it so difficult to attract them to our association? And here I come back to what was said before. So why don't we call ourselves international when 80% of us are in the first world, and why don't we call ourselves an association if we are not looking at those persons who don't have hair like mine, which is completely white. There's something there. Well, we have to be self-critical in this regard, let's face it. If this was the point you were making when you said, why are we not active in the areas where Barbara is, why aren't we in the courts, etc., why aren't we active in the areas Barbara talked about? This is a question I'm putting. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Cristina.
Thanks, Christina, for asking this question. Perhaps I wasn't clear enough, and what I said is that we are a profession 80%, well, within the association I'm talking about, 80% is in the 80% of interpreters are in the first world because there's a need for interpretation, and where there isn't a need for interpreters, they improvise. Interpreters in conflict zone, also, for example, taxi drivers, hairdressers, for example, whoever can do it, does it, for example, in other areas. Now, with regard to your second question, why aren't we able to attract young people? I think you understood it perfectly well. So we don't attract young people because they're young, they have a social conscience and an awareness of what's happening within society, and that's where they want to be. Now, when the association makes an effort to be in those places, then we will be transmitting a message that we are working with interpreters in conflict zones. If we look at the work Barbara is doing in zone, if we look at the humanitarian work that can be carried out, if we also look at other types of interpretation, sign language interpretation, that's an absolute need. And it's fantastic that it's entered our profession. And, for example, we have to ensure that the society is aware that we are all part of society. Now, some of us are more privileged than others, and as such, this colloquium itself is proof that in the association there is an awareness and a desire to understand things in a different way. Perhaps because we want to be more where we are needed and to have more young people join us. Olga.
Hola.
Hello, can you hear me? Good afternoon. My name is Olga Alberifar from Buenos Aires in Argentina. First point I'd like to make is I'd like to congratulate the speakers for the presentations, which have been very interesting and very enriching. Now, while the presentations were given, I was thinking that perhaps one of the main problems that AIIC has is the problem of visibility, whether we are visible or not. And so, I'd like to relate that to the fact of being present and visible where we are needed. Of course, we can't satisfy all the needs that there are. As such, what I'd like to know is within PRIMS or within AIIC, if we could think about a strategy, a plan, which would make it possible for us to have synergies with all those local actors in our different markets. If I look at the successful case of Argentina, at a certain time we had 3 groupings of interpreters. They decided to work in synergy with each other. The public translators at the Association, the Argentinian Association of Conference Interpreters, and AIIC. And from this moment, what happened was that we started to getting to know each other better. And I think that members of AIIC, we will get respect from other colleagues if we do this. We can't do everything. So, beyond the Vega program, the is a body within AIIC, which makes it possible to be visible where there is a need for interpretation beyond specific bodies for AIIC members. Is there that?
Era una pregunta para alguien en
Was that a question for anybody in particular, or was that a reflection? I see, Angela, I think that in different regions, and you have different markets, these type of contacts are going ahead. I don't know if Angela wants to add something to that with regard to AIIC. Perhaps Angela could add something to that. Angela? Yes, I'd just like to what Sergio said. This has to be organized at local level. I have always been against AIIC at central level getting involved in internal aspects of different regions. We don't have the necessary knowledge in order to do that. In Europe, in certain countries, in Germany, where I'm from, there are contacts, close contracts, and double affiliation. People are members of AIIC, they're also members of the national associations as well. But this is something that has to be organized and managed and decided on by members in their regions, and AIIC at international level should not get involved in that. Well, I'd like to respond to that. Just in a slightly different vein from what Angela said, is about being outside the local situation, but within AIIC. Since 2008, since the Assembly in 2008, they created a project, a group of interpreters. Well, they created a project which was for interpreters in conflict zones, and it's precisely related to that. They defend the situation of interpreters who are persecuted. They write to the president of governance and ministers of justice, where interpreters are abandoned once the interests of the countries are no longer there. And these interpreters and their families are persecuted, and the countries will not give them visas, for example. This is humanitarian work that is carried out, and it's massively important. Now, they have, together with other organizations and NGOs, they are setting out a roadmap with young interpreters who don't have professional interpreting training which is necessary. And what is the work that a particular committee on ethics can do? What can be admitted? What can be accepted with regards to employers as well? What can they expect from interpreters? These are all massively important aspects, and work is being done on the internet. AIIC at central level is working on some of these aspects. It's real work that's being done. Now, at this conference, this is another effort. It's calm, but what we're trying to do is to ensure that things start where they need to start, which is with awareness raising. And we had the committee of Christina de Castilla. They carry out massively important work with interpreters who work in courts, and things are moving. But this is happening, has only been happening for a short time, but at least they're moving.
Sorry, I just want to add, following on from Eduardo, our friend from Argentina, your question was about visibility of interpreters. And can I just ask a question? How many of you are members of your local convention bureau? 1.5. Okay. You know, convention bureaus exist in most of the cities that you come from. Their responsibility is to promote your city as a destination for conferences. In Europe, many interpreters join their convention bureau. Sometimes you have to pay, but it gives you a voice in that organization, along with venues, audiovisual providers, all the people who provide services for conferences. today's been great, but today we're speaking to ourselves in a way. The time has come to speak to other people in the industry. So check out your local convention bureau. It could be Medellin, Bogota, Buenos Aires, I don't know. They exist. Inquire about joining, and then you will meet lots of other professionals from the conference industry, but most importantly, they will meet you. And you will have a voice locally in what happens in the conference industry. Just a suggestion.
Hola, soy
Claudia Terrino from Chile, and I'm Vega representative for Chile. And I just wanted to make a comment on what Eduardo said and the colleague from Sergio. Can you explain what Vega is? Answer. It's a group with an inexplicable name. It's the name of a star, which used to be called the Group for Young Interpreters, and somebody decided to call it something different, call it Vega. What we do is we support those interpreters who are new, or student interpreters in their final year, who want to become interpreters with ethics, with quality, with best practices in their interpretation. Now the idea is to help them and not to stop them. So in Chile, exists groups in Chile, Japan, Turkey, where, for example, you carry out workshops in order to get close to these people so that they get to know what AIIC's doing and what are these best practices about. And so I'd like to make a comment, because the colleague asked why they don't want to join the association. And it's not just because they have a social conscience. They have them. They have that. Because they're millennials and they're interested in other things. They're interested in the world and they want to explore other things, of course. But also, because they are millennials, they feel completely, absolutely right to claim things that they haven't been able to get. This is what happens. And this happens in countries such as mine. They study interpretation as a bachelor's, and they learn English in their first and second year. It's not like they're studying literature or another degree and then they do a master's, which is what is done in Monterrey, in Georgetown, in Sorbonne, in the other major interpreting schools. So it's a study system which is mistaken, which is different, and they don't come out well prepared. And so what happens? Well, they are not well prepared with an adequate level, firstly. Secondly, and the old school AIIC, at least in our countries, Latin countries, they reject them. And why? They're not worthy of us. They're unworthy. And this has happened. This happened to a lot of people. In order to to be worthy of an AIIC signature, they were seen as unworthy. It's true that some of them aren't well prepared enough. So first of all, they have to pay 400 euros a year. They don't have that money. Secondly, they're not qualified, so they're not going to be able to work in order to get that money. Then there are rules. They have to meet all the different rules. They can't go where they want. They can't do what they want. They can't get the hotel, whatever. And it's very difficult for them. And what they ask in Vega workshops, what do I do? If I have to work with another, do I have to work with another person? Really? Yeah, and we have to be paid as two people? Well, how am I going to get the same as you if nobody knows me? Nobody's going to give me a contract. How do I even start? It's very difficult. What they say is, well, how am I not going to work for an agency? How can I start interpreting? So yes, they've got a social conscience, but the poor people have to start somewhere. And they can't do it with us, because there are lots of rules which we throw at them. To sum up, so in Vega we are working, trying to help them and get them to understand why to join and give them the tools necessary to help them join. Sergio. Claudia, I don't know if you want to answer that, or should we go on to the next question?
Buenas tardes, Silda Tejada.
Silda Tejada de Mexico, from Mexico. I'm an interpreter from Mexico, Central America and Caribbean region. I have no question, but just certain reflections that I'd like to make with regards to what has been said. I've been listening to the different points that have been made and also tell you about my experience. So I give classes in the university in interpretation and translation. This is a program that we have in Mexico, and one of the few courses in Latin America. And what I find is that as interpreters in the association, we need to make more of an effort when it comes to public policy in order to create programs for degrees, for example, in different countries, because what you see is that the Ministry of Education grants licenses to different programs which are not well developed, because you have different people developing programs, a linguist, whoever. They don't understand the real needs that there are for interpreter training programs. I think AIIC has been quite passive when it comes to reaching out to young people. There aren't training programs, remote training programs. They do loads of different remote training or distance learning programs, but what are we doing in terms of distance learning to help them? I spoke to AIIC Training and Professional Development. We made an effort to work with experienced interpreters to see if it was possible to achieve something in this regard. And we had a pilot program. We got 20 people to come. This was a program which didn't have huge infrastructure, but it was supported by AIIC Training and Professional Development and another institution as well. And human resources was also put forward by AIIC and Mexican colleagues. So conference interpreters were involved, and afterwards, I don't know if AIIC made any effort in this regard. So if you look at AIIC training, there's nothing done in terms of distance training, distance learning for young people. Now I'm just come from Panama. I work with Maya de Witt, presenting AIIC to sign language interpreters for the International Sign Languages Interpreters, International Association of Sign Language Interpreters. And this was an experience which was very enriching, and we were able to see how inflexible we were at times. I was presenting the association, and when we had the AIIC PowerPoint, I had to read a PowerPoint which was full of writing. So people hadn't heard of linguistic classification because they didn't know about that aspect. For example, they didn't know, for example, you needed different amount of people to support A's or B languages or C languages or different citrons, all that sort of thing. Everybody was like, what's this? And this is something massively complicated. So when you have, for example, all the different letters involved in that, to make that clear to everybody is extremely difficult. But when we did manage to explain it, we saw that sign language interpreters who have their own network within our organization, of course, there's Latin American Sign Language, they have the National Sign Language, and probably International Sign Language, probably American Sign Language, but nobody practices it regularly, and Spanish as well. And the admission forms in English. So things like this, we have to reflect on that. We have to think about what we're going to do. I think AIIC needs to be more flexible, and it has to reach out more, such that interpreters in other regions, when other categories of interpreters, maybe who work with indigenous languages or in emerging markets, perhaps that's something we need to be doing. Thanks, Hilda. I think the openness, or the opening that was made towards sign language interpreters was a step forward in this direction. Anybody else wanted to take the floor?
I'm Raffaella Marchese from Italy. I wanted to share with you something we have done in Italy in order to increase visibility of AIIC and also to increase the status of interpreters as professionals. I don't know whether you are familiar with the latest developments in the Italian legislation, but now interpreters are part of officially recognized. They're officially recognized professionors. There is a new law that has been passed that has made this possible, and we have fought these battles together with other interpreters association in Italy. This goes with a number of duties. One of them, the most important one, is continuous professional development. Now we have in Italy the obligation to attend courses for professional development on an yearly basis. This has had very important repercussions on our status and also on our visibility. And more young interpreters look at AIIC now as a place to be, because we are setting the standards. We are proving that we do our best to be professionals, as engineers do, as lawyers do, as other intellectual professions do. So this has had important repercussions. Good interpreters from other associations are looking at AIIC as the organization, the associations to be part of. And we are seeing many more interpreters coming and becoming AIIC members in Italy. And also many young people that are interested, they come, they attend. We opened the doors of our courses because we do organize many courses. We have been organizing courses for 2 years now. And we've opened the doors to the students for free. Whenever we have seats available, we ask students to come and attend, and this has made us more visible towards the students, the existing interpreters, and also companies. Companies start looking at AIIC Italian interpreters as with different eyes. I don't know whether you know that IBM invited us, AIIC interpreters, to speak at one of their conferences. They were having a huge event, a one-week event on Watson artificial intelligence. They wanted us to be there and speak about the profession, about interpreting. That was probably the first time in Italy interpreters were asked to go and speak. This is the result of this activity that we have been performing in Italy, and it has definitely increased.
Rafaela, te tengo que interrumpir.
See, that's it.
Sorry, I have to interrupt you, Rafaela. Do you have a question, or was it just a comment?
Answer to one of the questions: how can you improve visibility?
Gracias.
Thank you. I'm Evelyn Bernard. I'm Polynesian, and I'm here since November, and I work for a church based in Kansas City. My question has to do with new technologies, the subject that we talked about this morning, having to do with conference interpreters. But we're talking here about the second panel, right? The subject of the second panel. All right, but the panelists who were here for this morning sessions are not here. When I got my motorcycle license, the rule was to anticipate and anticipate and anticipate always on the road. So how can we as conference interpreters anticipate what is happening with technological changes, and what are the resources that you can suggest? I fear this might not be the right panel for your questions. I don't know if somebody wants to take up the question, but I am sure that the cocktail hour will be an ideal time for somebody to take up your question. I think if you heard the comments by Hilda and Rafaela in terms of how we become trained, whether this is interpreters who have vast experience or whether it's new in a market that's always evolving and changing, we can't ever be confident or rest that we've done enough in terms of training, not only in terms of technology. And I'll ask a question since I have the microphone. I asked Rob this, and I come back to ask this in Spanish. Rob, when you spoke about markets, you talked about South America and you talked about Colombia. You said these were very promising markets, that there was a novelty effect, you called it. Can you give us any research or data about these effects? What's the effect of these? How long do they last? Can we think about this in terms of something that's economically valuable? Is it something that will just become the next fashionable country?
Thank you. Okay. Before I answer that one, if I can quickly answer the lady's question, there are two words. Corbin Ball. C-O-R-B-I-N, Ball. Corbin Ball is the global guru for technology as it impacts the conference industry. Just Google him and go to his website. He's a real guru. You should have him at one of your future conferences, but he's very expensive. Oh yeah, I'm really cheap. We're in Colombia, so let's speak about this country. Everyone in this room knows that this is a good news story, that Colombia of today is not the Colombia of a few decades ago. It's a fairy tale. It's not, of course, perfect by any means, but you know, it's a good news story, and the conference industry likes those narratives that here was a country PCOs would have hesitated a lot before bringing an international conference here. You were famous for all the wrong reasons. Now you've been in the news a lot, and the conclusion is favorable. It's just the kind of destination that PCOs like. Novelty value, the same as China. Most people in the big marché émetteur. Can't say it in English. The big marché émetteur. Most of those countries, Europe, North America, and so on, most of them haven't been here. So for any international association to propose a conference in Bogota, Medellin, Cartagena, it's novelty, and they're going to get members coming not only to enjoy the conference but also to come and enjoy the destination. With destinations like this, what we often see is that delegates or participants, I should say, participants come with their spouses, their partners, because they decide to turn a conference trip to Colombia into a little holiday to tour around. Now, they don't do that so much if they're Europeans and the conference is in Paris or London, because people have been there a lot. They fly in, enjoy the conference, and fly out. So it's a good question from Sergio, because it doesn't last for a long time, this effect. And again, it's your convention bureaus, national and city-based convention bureaus, who should be moving now to capitalize on this special moment in your history and to do everything they can to bring big events here. PCOs are fairly conservative by nature, which explains the big popularity of cities like London and Paris and Berlin, even though they're not the cheapest of cities. They're tried and tested, and PCOs like predictability, but the associations also like novelty. And so I would say, use that novelty that you have. They will come here, of course, expecting everything to go well. They won't excuse you if things are not perfect, and by that I mean everything for the conference, the condition of the venue, the technology, the interpreting, of course. They will expect the best, but it's an exciting time for the South American continent, and I think for Colombia in particular.
¿Hay más preguntas?
Are there further questions from the floor? Everyone is looking forward to that drink. I will permit myself an additional question, and a word of thanks to Rob, because there have been comments about honoraria, and Rob has made a great effort to be accessible to our cost structure as an association. So I want to publicly recognize that, because he's made a significant effort to be with us today. And a quick question. Following up on the presentation we heard and the market changes, the economic changes, do you have an idea as to how this might affect the use of languages? Is it all going to just end up being in English? Or is there the expectation that certain markets, the Latin American market, the Chinese market, will include other languages, or that certain languages will increase in importance?
Yeah, what I notice, because I speak at a lot of conferences, and especially in Europe, and I've said this to a few of you today, is that when I go to a country like Serbia or Poland or Slovakia, and there are interpreters, when I look around the audience when I'm giving my presentation, very often the only people listening to the interpreters are the old guys. The ones my age and older, who in those countries had to learn Russian at school and not English at all. The young Slovakians and Serbians have I think they have no need of the interpreting services. So, of course, the rise of English is unstoppable, but I think we have to set against that those other countries I mentioned, like China, Thailand, Malaysia, where they're beginning to appear at conferences from those countries, international conferences. They want to travel. They now have the money and the political freedom to travel to conferences. And don't forget, it wasn't so long ago that Chinese people couldn't. So certainly those languages, if I was advising students these days, I would say look at those languages. Russian, of course, a big country, with people in the professions, traveling more and more. But again, a lot of the African languages are growing in importance as well, because those people also are in the same category of having the ability to travel, the means to travel. So I think, it's very surprising sometimes if you specialize in a minority language, you discover the need for it. But if there was only one language, I would say Chinese.
Eduardo, querías...
Eduardo, yes. The question and Rob's answer lead me to want to add a word about what is in the title of this afternoon session, which has to do with geopolitics. The issue of languages and the prevalence or predominance of English can be perfectly linked to the polarity or the non-polarity economically in the world today. To the extent that we might be able to understand the emergence of Trump not only as a permanent tweet or a comic televised relief, but also move towards isolationism and protectionism in terms of the United States projecting its role in the world, and a disengagement, as it's called, of the United States as a major world power in any area in which there won't be an immediate benefit. That may not be the only policy, but it is the policy of the largest or the most important superpower in the world today. So if we consider this phenomenon of the U.S. and the end of a cycle with the power of Russia, we can begin to appreciate that the world is no longer bipolar, but third powers are important. And the emergence of mid-range powers like India and others, and the growth of Asia as the source for an enormous amount of development and what specialists say is the focus of development and growth. I'm not that specialist, but we shouldn't take for granted certain things. I'll be a little bit the devil's advocate here. I'm not so certain that from here to 20 years, the prevalence of English will be what we expect it is. I think we're moving from a world where plurilingualism is going to be waning in favor of a word of more bilingual communication. Mid-range powers will be interested in negotiating with China or with Japan, and multilingualism might not be worth it, where businessmen from Thailand and China and Japan and other Asian countries will get together. So the weight of languages today, which we assume is the case because it's been so for 40 years, doesn't mean that it'll necessarily be the case for the next 40 years. So what I'm saying is it's clear that all of these strategic anticipations or provisions that allow us to organize ourselves in terms of a choice of careers or a choice of degrees or investments even, these are investments that require long-range expectations, and we move in a mid and short-term anticipation. So I think we should be wary, we should be careful to not assume that what is today will remain. Many things can, fortunately, be very different than what we fear or expect.
Thank you.
Atsa Togo is my name. I'm Cameroonian. I would like to thank Rob particularly for what he just shared about bringing us together and what PCOs can do. I think we'll anticipate in my country, particularly I'll try to meet the convention center manager of our country. Cameroon is known as Africa in miniature. We're particularly rich, and we could make good of either post-conference or pre-conference tours as Cartagena would be doing or Colombia would be doing now. So I think I would like to thank you for leading us along those lines, and I express my appreciation. My question particularly is addressed to Gilles, because I couldn't ask this in the morning. We are particularly threatened. We also have the technological threat, which we now want to transform into an advantage. But we're threatened by the practice of equipment owners, particularly congress rental in Africa and in Cameroon, where as managers of conferences, you are contacted and you now do the recruitment of interpreters. Before, in my countries, interpreters would recruit or would contract the services of the equipment providers, SI, but now it's the reverse, because you have huge arsenal of equipment and you impose the rates on the interpreters. I worked in East Africa and down to Southern Africa, and particularly the rates of Congress rental are not the best. Now, because they're not the best, they don't work with AIIC interpreters. Now, because they don't work with the AIIC interpreters, they're working with amateurs or non-professionals who accept $200, $300, and this is a worse threat to our profession, which we want to protect by looking at the future of this profession in the days ahead. My question is, are you aware of that? My question is, if you are, what is your concern? What is your take on it? If we indeed, with the PCOs, with the providers like you, we want to protect this profession, we are all involved in communication, we are all involved in event management, we are all involved in the progress of mankind. Is it fair? What do you think? How do we make sure that you don't squeeze the interpreters, well-trained interpreters, devoted, consecrated, professional interpreters, push them out of the market, and use quacks and kill communication and kill society?
So that's a lot of responsibility.
Nobody wants to kill Gilles.
Gilles.
That's a big responsibility.
The We Are Aware Association is structured right now at this moment. Of course, we have 45 members and 45 different owners, and this is not part of our internal regulation of what the owners, each individual company, do as a practice for hiring interpreters and everything. That's a good point. That's something we could raise in the future. Because no, I'm not necessarily aware of the exact situation in every different country. In Africa, as you know, we have a very limited penetration of the market. We just added Rwanda recently as a new member, and we, of course, we would like to have more members from this area. But no, I was not aware of this exact situation, and maybe we can talk a bit later about that. We have a date then. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. It's almost 6 o'clock. It's time for us to wrap up, and I need to give the floor for a few minutes to Eduardo to give him a chance to give us a summary. Closing thoughts. I'm relieved that it's only a few minutes that are left for me to try to summarize the meeting today. This exceeds any capacity that I might remotely be aware of, be able to have. I will share two words with you. It's been a wonderful surprise to see the fruits of this initiative, not only because of what we heard from the speakers and the panels, but also from you, the way in which very conscientiously and carefully and thoughtfully these issues have been raised, and it's been wonderful to see the way in which our next assembly, our next AIIC assembly, will be able to draw on the report and the result of these efforts. Your own engagement and participation has been wonderful. I won't repeat what has already been said, and you can be relieved at that. But I would underscore and contrast a few aspects. One, the two dimensions of our profession this morning and this afternoon. As to this morning's panel, I'd like to propose a conclusion, perhaps, in terms of a learning methodology, the way in which we can respond to the challenge of technique can't be a single answer. It'll take at least two steps. Initially, I think we have to give an answer to the present generation of interpreters, all of us who work every day with a microphone as part of our work. And for this generation, we have to be able to answer how we'll face or fare with these new technologies. This has to do with a new way of learning. But I think we also have to answer the challenge as to what the opportunities are for new kinds of work. We should be able to address that as well. What are the palliative measures, if you will? What can we do in terms of training? Are there trainings that are possible in regards to new techniques to have access to markets that will be able to satisfy demands of new kinds of clients? And we can also think about how to answer new markets. Rob spoke of markets, but this is the traditional conference market that continues to grow. But there are other markets, and another market that we didn't talk about. This is the market that's on the internet, that's in the cloud, and that uses interpreters wherever they are found in the world. This has to do with the immediate future that will affect our own generation of working interpreters. And then also the answer to future generations, what we were talking about in terms of an intergenerational responsibility. What is our answer ethically, spiritually, if you will, morally, to those interpreters that will come in the future by those of us that have already had years of training and experience? And how will we react, or what will we do to involve other forms of interpreters? What taxonomy are we going to come up with? Are we going to define them or not? That's all I'll say in terms of this morning. And then I found that there's some interesting contrasts. It is true that training will be important for us, not only to be able to incorporate court interpreting, humanitarian or conflict zones, community interpreting, but this training will be wholly different than the technical training that we need to be able to work in those areas in which we were speaking about this morning. This doesn't have much to do with the challenge of ethically involving ourselves in the new consecutive techniques that could evolve. There's a whole range of issues here that might seem to be completely counter or contradictory one to another. To the extent that we may decide to include this as part of our ambit of work. I think another aspect that's important for both of these, we were speaking this morning about the language techniques in which new technologies allow us to think about the different phonality, a lack of emotion, symbolic language. There's a coldness or a detachment in terms of the rhetorical style and an isolation, whereas interpreting in a social community sense is almost entirely different, where there's an emotional commitment and an engagement that can affect us not only personally, but also affect our own performance, our own delivery. We need to take that into account as well. Finally, I'll make a final comment. Barbara mentioned this in her presentation as something that's important for interpreters working in conflict zones and in humanitarian actions. The issue of neutrality. We haven't even begun to talk about neutrality. The perception of neutrality is important, and neutrality also involves an attitude, but it isn't hidden. I don't think that we can hide behind our microphones. The aspect of ideology and neutrality is something we haven't even begun to address. Ideology isn't absent from any discourse, from any speech. There's a lot of work done on this. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be neutral or that we should take common cause with one part or another, but we do need to understand how fallible our own instrument of speech is. In terms of ethics, I think all of the work that's being done with interpreters of a new ethical paradigm, Barbara mentioned this, is very important for these new fields of work. This is important for us in our own universe. We have an ancient ethical code, but all of these other aspects that really have to do with the marrow of our ethical concerns when an interpreter has to work in the field, or an interpreter's own rendition will absolve or condemn a defendant, and the perception of what we do, all of the symbology, involves a whole discussion we haven't even undertaken. To the extent that our association will work beyond the scope of just our working conditions, and I think we do need to be concerned about the material survival of our profession, we need to understand what all is involved in our work. And we'll be better able to communicate to society at large who we are and what we do, and we'll be able to recognize us and recognize us for who and what we want to be known for. I hope these will be useful for us to undertake positive work, profitable work that will be long-lasting for many years to come.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you. Claudia. So, we've now come to the end, and the only thing separating us from the cocktail are the thanks that need to be given. First of all, I'd obviously like to thank the panelists who have been with us today. They've been excellent. And I think the result is that all our expectations have been met. Now, also the local organizing interpreters, all those in the group who've helped, logistical organizers, the voluntary interpreters as well, and also like to thank the volunteer interpreters, Stephen, Andrew, Sebastian, Maria Yolanda, Vivian, Sylvia, and Paolo, who have helped us this afternoon, as well as Pablo, Ingrid, and Ana Maria this morning. I would also like to thank all people from Congress Colombia. They've massively helped to make this a technical success as well, and the South American region for all their support and for inviting us for a cocktail. I'd like to hand over to Martin, who's going to tell us what the festive part of the day will be. So, on behalf of the South American region, which I represent, I'd like to publicly thank PRIMS for having chosen the South American region to organize this meeting. I'd also like to thank all the members of PRIMS Standing Committee who have been working hard to ensure that this is the success that we are seeing. I'd also like to thank local colleagues. Without them, this wouldn't have been possible. So I'd like to offer my deep thanks to them. And also, thanks to all participants who have come from Colombia and many other places from far away, some from nearer, and also people who are working in the field of interpretation. South American region would like to invite you to a cocktail drink by the pool, and we hope that you will join us to have a few drinks and some extended conversation there. Thank you very much.